Before we dive into this file, if you are fascinated by the hidden histories of the Cold War and the secrets buried in classified archives, please make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We are uncovering these stories one file at a time. It was a Tuesday afternoon in Vienna, November 14th, 1985. The weather was typical for that time of year, a gray, oppressive ceiling of clouds that leaked a freezing drizzle onto the cobblestones. The American embassy on Boltzmanngasse was, as always, a fortress of quiet activity. To the casual observer, it was just a diplomatic building, a place for visas and official receptions. But in 1985, Vienna was the nerve center of espionage in Europe, a city where the boundary between East and West was porous, and where intelligence agencies from every major power operated in a delicate, silent dance. At 2:14 p.m., a man approached the Marine Guard at the secondary entrance. He did not look like a diplomat. He did not look like a tourist. He was wearing a heavy, ill-fitting wool coat that seemed to be of Eastern Bloc manufacture, scuffed boots that had seen miles of walking, and a flat cap pulled low over his eyes. He was gaunt, his face hidden behind a thick, unkempt beard that was streaked with premature gray. He looked, for all intents and purposes, like a drifter, perhaps a refugee who had slipped through the cracks of the city. The Marine on duty, a corporal named Hayes, stepped forward, his hand resting instinctively near his holster. He was about to tell the man to move along, to inform him that the consulate entrance was around the corner, when the man stopped 3 feet away and looked up. His eyes, blue and piercing despite the exhaustion rimming them, locked onto the Marine. He didn't speak German. He didn't speak the local dialect. He spoke perfect, flat, Midwestern American English. He said a single sentence, a sequence of words that made no sense in ordinary conversation, but carried a weight that froze the corporal in place. "I am Arthur Vance, Operation Silent Echo, Initiate Protocol 7 Alpha." The Marine didn't know the name. He didn't know the operation. But he knew the protocol. 7 Alpha was a distress code reserved for high-priority intelligence personnel in immediate catastrophic danger. It was a code that wasn't supposed to be spoken by a man standing on the sidewalk. It was a code for radio bursts from safe houses that were being compromised. Hayes ushered the man inside the security vestibule immediately, locking the blast doors behind him. He picked up the secure line to the station chief. Within 3 minutes, 2 men in plain suits arrived. They didn't ask the man for his passport. They didn't ask him to empty his pockets. They simply looked at him, their faces pale, as if they were looking at a specter. Because, according to every file in the Central Intelligence Agency, according to the commendations on the wall at Langley, and according to the pension checks being sent to a widow in Virginia, Arthur Vance had been dead for 3 years. He had been declared lost in field in October 1982, presumed captured and eliminated during a botched extraction in Moscow. There had been a funeral. There was a star carved into the marble wall at CIA headquarters. And yet, here he was, shivering in the vestibule of the Vienna embassy, asking for a glass of water and a secure line to the Deputy Director of Operations. The return of Arthur Vance would trigger one of the most intense, secretive, and psychologically complex investigations of the late Cold War. It was an event that challenged the agency's understanding of loyalty, survival, and the fluid nature of truth in a world built on deception. This is the story of where he had been, why he came back, and the terrifying possibility that the man who walked into the embassy was not the same man who had vanished 3 years earlier. To understand the shock of Vance's return, we must understand the nature of his disappearance. In 1982, the Cold War had entered a deep freeze. The détente of the 1970s was a distant memory. Tensions were high, fueled by proxy conflicts and a renewed nuclear arms race. In Moscow, the atmosphere was paranoid and brittle. Arthur Vance was a deep-cover officer, though not in the traditional sense of posing as a Soviet citizen. He was operating under official cover, attached to the trade mission, but his real work was handling high-level assets within the Soviet military bureaucracy. He was 38 years old, a veteran of the agency, with a reputation for extreme caution and meticulous planning. He wasn't a cowboy. He didn't take unnecessary risks. Operation Silent Echo was his primary directive. It involved a source inside the Soviet Ministry of General Machine Building, the department responsible for the space program and, more importantly, ballistic missiles. The source, codenamed Topaz, had been providing critical intelligence on Soviet guidance systems. On the night of October 12, 1982, Vance was scheduled to meet Topaz for a brush pass in Gorky Park. It was a routine maneuver, a quick exchange of a package while passing on a dark path. Vance had done it a dozen times. He left his apartment at 7:09 p.m. He took a circuitous route, checking for surveillance, what the pros call dry cleaning. He was clear. He entered the park at 7:45 p.m. That was the last time any American personnel saw him. At 8:30 p.m., he failed to report to the designated signal site. At 9:00 p.m., the station chief in Moscow declared an emergency. Emergency protocols were activated. Safe houses were alerted. But the radio silence from Vance was absolute. 3 days later, through back-channel communications and intercepted Soviet police transmissions, the station pieced together a grim narrative. There had been an incident in the park, a struggle. Soviet internal security forces had cordoned off a section of the embankment near the Moskva River. There were reports of a body being pulled from the water, though no identification was ever confirmed. More damning was the silence from Topaz. The source vanished simultaneously. The prevailing theory at Langley was that the operation had been blown from the inside. Topaz had been compromised, and Vance had walked into a trap. Given the nature of his work and the secrets he carried, the KGB would have had no reason to keep him alive once they had extracted what they needed, or if the confrontation had turned violent immediately. By November 1982, the file was effectively closed. The agency conducted a damage assessment. They assumed Vance had been interrogated before the end, so codes were changed, other assets were moved or put on ice. The damage was calculated, the loss was mourned, and the machinery of the Cold War ground on. His wife Eleanor was told that her husband had died in a tragic accident while traveling for the trade mission. She wasn't told the details. She wasn't told about the river or the KGB. She was given a folded flag and a survivor's pension. She held a memorial service in Arlington, burying an empty casket because the Soviets never returned a body. For 3 years, Arthur Vance was a ghost story told to new recruits, a warning about the dangers of the Moscow station. He was a statistic, until he walked into that embassy in Vienna. The man in the Vienna safe room finished his glass of water. His hands were shaking, a subtle tremor that he tried to hide by clasping them together on the metal table. The room was sterile, soundproofed, and cold. Across from him sat the station chief of Vienna, a man named Robert Caldwell, and a senior counterintelligence officer named Sarah Jenkins. They had been observing him for 2 hours. A medical team had examined him. He was malnourished, showing signs of vitamin deficiency and long-term physical stress. He had scars on his back and legs that were consistent with rough living, perhaps imprisonment, though they didn't look like the surgical scars of torture. They looked like the scars of survival. His fingerprints had been taken and transmitted via secure fax to Washington. The confirmation had come back 20 minutes ago. It was a positive match. The man was Arthur Vance. But identity is more than fingerprints. In the world of intelligence, a man who has been in Soviet custody for 3 years is treated as a compromised weapon until proven otherwise. "Arthur," Caldwell began, his voice neutral, "we need to understand how you got here. We need to know where you've been." Vance looked up. His eyes were adjusted to the dim light now. He spoke slowly, as if he had to search for the words, as if English was a tool he hadn't used in a long time. "I wasn't in custody," Vance said. "Not in the way you think." "Where were you?" Jenkins asked. She was watching his micro-expressions, looking for the telltale signs of deception or rehearsal. "I was in Siberia," Vance said. "But I wasn't in a gulag. I was hiding." The story he began to tell was impossible. It was a narrative of survival that defied the logic of the surveillance state. He claimed that on that night in Gorky Park, the trap had been sprung, but not by the KGB. He claimed that Topaz, the source, had warned him at the last second. There had been a third party, a rogue element within the Soviet apparatus that was hunting them both. "I went into the river," Vance said. "Not because I was dead, but because it was the only way out. The current took me downstream. I managed to pull myself out near the industrial district. I knew I couldn't go back to the embassy. They were watching the gates. They were watching the safe houses. I knew the protocol. If you can't come in, you go deep. For 3 years? Caldwell asked, skepticism dripping from his tone. You went deep for 3 years without sending a single signal? I couldn't, Vance replied. I had no equipment, no contacts, and I was being hunted. I made my way east. I hopped freight trains. I worked manual labor in collective farms where they didn't ask for papers if you worked hard enough. I became a ghost. He described a journey that sounded like something out of a 19th century adventure novel. He spoke of sleeping in barns in the Urals, of stealing food from markets in Omsk, of working as a mute laborer in a timber camp near Lake Baikal. He claimed he had slowly, painfully worked his way back west, waiting for a moment, a crack in the Iron Curtain, to slip through. And how did you cross into Austria? Jenkins asked. I didn't cross directly, Vance said. I came through Hungary, the border near Sopron. There was a flood 3 days ago. The patrol schedules were disrupted. I swam. He lifted his hands. They were raw, the skin cracked. I came back, Vance said, his voice dropping to a whisper. I came back because I have something. The mission, Operation Silent Echo. It wasn't finished. Caldwell and Jenkins exchanged a look. This was the pivot point. This was the moment where the story would either gain traction or fall apart. What do you mean? Caldwell asked. Topaz didn't just warn me, Vance said. He gave me the package. Before I went into the water, he shoved it into my coat. I've carried it for 3 years. It's not paper, it's microfilm. And it's sewn into the lining of this jacket. The jacket was taken immediately to the technical lab in the basement of the embassy. Technicians wearing white gloves and using delicate cutting instruments opened the heavy wool lining of the coat Vance had worn. There, wrapped in layers of oilcloth and brittle plastic, was a small cylindrical object. It was a standard-issue spycraft container, the kind used for dead drops in the early 80s. When they developed the film, the images were degraded but legible. They were schematics. Technical drawings of a guidance system for the Soviet SS-20 Sabre missile. But these weren't just standard blueprints. These were modifications, specifically upgrades that would allow the missiles to evade the proposed American anti-ballistic missile defenses. If this intelligence was real, it was gold. It was the kind of information that shifted strategic policy. It explained why the Soviets had been so confident in the Geneva talks. They had an ace up their sleeve, a technical leap that Washington didn't know about. But the existence of the microfilm created more questions than it answered. Back in Washington, the director of Central Intelligence convened a small, closed-door working group. They were the Vance Committee. Their job was to determine if Arthur Vance was a hero who had pulled off the greatest survival feat in agency history, or if he was a Trojan horse sent by Moscow to feed the U.S. false intelligence. Think about it, argued Marcus Thorne, a senior analyst on the Soviet desk. He carries this film for 3 years, through Siberian timber camps, through river crossings, and the film is perfectly preserved, and he just happens to walk into Vienna right before the summit in Geneva. It's too convenient, agreed another analyst. The Soviets know we're developing defense systems. Maybe they want us to think they've already beaten them. Maybe this film is disinformation designed to make us abandon our own research. But what if it's real? Asked the deputy director. If Vance is telling the truth, and we ignore this, we are leaving the entire Western Alliance vulnerable to a first-strike capability we can't stop. We have to verify the man before we can verify the data. The order was given. Bring Vance home. But not to a parade. He was to be transported on a military flight to an undisclosed location in Virginia, a frantic facility known as the Farm, but a secluded safe house nearby. He was not going home to his wife. Not yet. Eleanor Vance lived in a small, quiet house in Alexandria. She had not remarried. The grief of losing Arthur had been a heavy, slow-moving fog that had taken 2 years to lift. She had only recently begun to feel like herself again. She had taken a job as a librarian at the university. She had stopped looking at the door every time a car drove by. When the black sedan pulled into her driveway at 7 a.m. on a Wednesday, she knew. In the world of intelligence families, a black sedan at an odd hour usually meant bad news. She assumed it was about his pension, or perhaps a posthumous award that couldn't be mailed. When the two agents, men she didn't recognize, knocked on her door, she wiped her hands on a dish towel and answered. "Mrs. Vance?" one of them asked. "Yes. We need you to come with us. It's a matter of national security." "Is it about Arthur?" she asked, her heart hammering a sudden, painful rhythm. "Ma'am, please, just come with us." They drove her to a secure facility. They didn't take her to a waiting room. They took her to an office where a man named Harris, an old friend of Arthur's and a senior officer, was waiting. "Eleanor," Harris said, standing up. He looked tired. "There's no easy way to say this. Arthur is alive." The room seemed to tilt. Eleanor sat down hard in the chair. "Alive? You told me. You showed me the report. You said he drowned." "We were wrong," Harris said. "He turned up in Vienna 2 days ago. He's back in the States now." "I want to see him," she said, her voice shaking. "You can't," Harris said gently. "Not yet. He's in debriefing. It's a complicated situation, Eleanor. He's been gone 3 years. In Soviet territory, we have to be sure." "Sure of what?" she snapped, a flash of anger cutting through the shock. "Sure that he's my husband, or sure that he's yours?" "Both," Harris admitted. He explained the situation, or as much as he could. He explained the suspicion, the possibility of brainwashing, the fear of a double agent. "I need you to help us, Eleanor," Harris said. "You know him better than anyone, better than we do. We need you to talk to him. We need you to tell us if the man in that room is the man you married. You want me to interrogate my husband? We want you to visit him, talk to him, ask him things only he would know. But more than that, feel him. A wife knows, if he's acting, if he's hiding something. You'll know." It was a cruel request, but in the Cold War, cruelty was often just a logistical necessity. Eleanor agreed. She had to know. The meeting took place in a living room that wasn't a living room. It was a set, a comfortable room inside the safe house, monitored by cameras and microphones hidden in the molding. Arthur Vance sat on the sofa. He had been shaved, his hair cut. He was wearing clean civilian clothes, chinos and a sweater that looked too large for his gaunt frame. When Eleanor walked in, he stood up. For a long minute, neither of them moved. They just looked at each other, spanning the gap of 3 years and a funeral. "Elle," he whispered. It was his nickname for her. She walked over to him, slowly, as if approaching a wild animal. She reached out and touched his face. His skin was rougher than she remembered. His eyes were older, but it was him. The way he held his shoulders, the slight tilt of his head. "You're real," she said. "I tried to come back," he said, his voice cracking. "Every day, I had to stay alive." She hugged him then, and he collapsed into her, burying his face in her neck. He wept. It was a deep guttural sound of release. In the control room next door, the analysts watched the monitors. "Heart rate is elevated," a technician noted. "Pupil dilation consistent with extreme emotional stress. If he's faking this, he's the best actor since Olivier." But Harris, watching the screen, wasn't looking at the biometrics. He was looking at the hands. He noticed that while Arthur was hugging his wife, his left hand was patting her back in a rhythmic, repetitive motion. It looked like comfort, but Harris zoomed the camera in. Tap, 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 tap. It was subtle, but it was a pattern. Was it a nervous tick, or was it a signal? But who was he signaling, Eleanor, or the camera he surely knew was there? After the embrace, they sat and talked. Eleanor asked him about the small things. The name of their first dog, Barnaby. The place they went on their honeymoon, Cape Cod. He answered everything correctly, but there was a flatness to it, a detachment. "Did you think about me?" she asked. "Every day," he said. "I used to recite the layout of our house in my head. The blue tiles in the kitchen, the crack in the ceiling of the guest room. It kept me sane." Eleanor froze for a second, a fraction of a second. The analysts missed it, but Harris caught it. She smiled, nodded, and squeezed his hand. When she left the room an hour later, Harris met her in the hallway. "Well?" he asked. Eleanor looked at him, her face pale. "It's him. He knows everything." "But," Harris pressed, "I saw you hesitate." "He mentioned the blue tiles in the kitchen," she said quietly. So, we remodeled the kitchen 6 months before he left for Moscow, she said. We replaced the blue tiles with white ones. He hated the blue tiles. He was the one who tore them out. Harris felt a chill go down his spine. Are you sure? He was there, she said. He did the work himself. We laughed about how ugly the blue ones were. Why would he say blue? Harris asked. Maybe he forgot, Eleanor said, her voice trembling. Trauma messes with memory. Or maybe he's reciting a memory from a file. Harris finished. A file that wasn't updated with the renovation. Chapter 7. The Discrepancy. The blue tile incident became the cornerstone of the skepticism against Vance. It was a small detail, but in counterintelligence, the small details are the ones that hang you. The interrogation intensified. They didn't tell Vance about the mistake. They wanted to see if he would make more. They drilled him on his journey. They asked for specifics about the timber camp near Lake Baikal. Who was the foreman? Jenkins asked during a grueling 6-hour session. A man named Lev, Vance said. Big man, missing 2 fingers on his left hand. The agency cross-referenced this with satellite imagery and existing intelligence on Soviet labor camps. There was a camp in that region, and they did have records of a foreman fitting that description. The detail was perfect. Too perfect. That's the problem, Thorne, the analyst, argued in the war room. His memory of the cover story, the survival journey, is high definition. It's cinematic. But his memory of his actual life, the kitchen tiles, is flawed. It's like the survival story was drilled into him, but the personal history is fading. Or, the deputy director countered, he spent 3 years living in hell, focusing on the immediate reality of survival, and his memories of home have blurred. That happens to POWs all the time. We need to test the microfilm, Harris said. The technical data. If the data is fake, the man is fake. The data was sent to a team of missile engineers at a secure facility in New Mexico. They ran simulations. They built models based on the schematics Vance had brought back. 3 days later, the report came back. It works, the lead engineer told Harris over a secure line. The physics is sound. If they build this guidance system, our current interceptors won't track it. It's brilliant engineering. If this is disinformation, they just handed us the blueprint for a better missile for free. No one gives away tech this good just to fool us. This was the paradox. The man's story had holes, but the gift he brought was genuine. Unless, Harris said, staring at the wall, the gift is the bait. They give us the tech, so we trust him. And once he's inside, once he's cleared and back in the fold, what does he do then? While the CIA debated his loyalty, Vance was moved to a lower security holding area within the facility. He was allowed books, a radio, and better food. He seemed to relax. He wrote letters to Eleanor, apologizing for the confusion and promising he would be home soon. But Vance wasn't relaxing. He was waiting. On the night of November 24th, a storm knocked out the primary power grid in the county. The facility's backup generators kicked in immediately. There was a 10-second flicker in the surveillance systems. In those 10 seconds, Vance moved. He didn't try to escape. He didn't run for the perimeter fence. He went to the ventilation grate in his room, which he had been slowly loosening with the metal tab of a zipper he'd pried off his pants. He slipped a small piece of paper into the ductwork. It wasn't until the power came back on that the guards noticed him sitting on his bed, reading a book, as if nothing had happened. But the sensors in the ductwork, sensors designed to detect chemical agents or smoke, triggered a low-level alert. A maintenance crew went to check the airflow. They found the paper. It was a note, written on a scrap torn from the flyleaf of a book. It contained a series of numbers, coordinates, and a time. Harris held the note in the debriefing room. He threw it on the table in front of Vance. "Who is this for?" Harris demanded. "You're trying to communicate. Is there a receiver nearby? Is there a mole in the facility?" Vance looked at the note. He didn't deny it. He smiled, a cold, tired smile. "It's not for a mole, Harris," Vance said. "It's for you." "Me?" "Those coordinates," Vance said. "Check them. It's a location in East Berlin, a safe deposit box in a bank that handles accounts for the Stasi." "Why are you giving me this now?" "Because you don't trust me." Vance said. And you shouldn't. The blue tiles. I know I got it wrong. As soon as I said it, I saw Eleanor's face. I knew. So you admit it? You're not Arthur Vance? I am Arthur Vance, he said fiercely. But I'm not the Arthur Vance who left. The Arthur Vance who left didn't know what I know now. Check the box, Harris. Then we can talk about who I really am. Chapter 9. The Berlin Box. The agency scrambled a team in Berlin. Using the coordinates and a key code Vance provided, they accessed a blind account in a bank in the Friedrichstrasse district. Inside the box they found a dossier. It wasn't Soviet intelligence. It was American. It was a file containing transcripts of communications between a high-ranking CIA official and the KGB. It detailed the betrayal of 1982. It proved that Operation Silent Echo wasn't blown by the source Topaz. It was blown by someone in Langley. Someone who had sold Vance out to protect a different, more valuable operation. The official implicated in the file was the Deputy Director of Operations, the man currently overseeing Vance's debriefing. Harris read the transmitted contents of the file in his office. His hands shook. The narrative shifted instantly. Vance hadn't been hiding from the KGB for 3 years. He had been hiding from the CIA. He had stayed in the cold, collecting evidence, surviving on the fringes, because he knew if he came back too soon, the traitor at the top would silence him. He needed the ultimate insurance policy, the missile schematics, to buy his way back in the door, to get into a room where he could expose the rot. The blue tile mistake wasn't a sign he was a fake. It was a sign of the immense psychological pressure he was under, trying to maintain a cover story of being a lost survivor while concealing his true mission, a counterintelligence investigation conducted by a single man from the inside of the enemy's territory. Chapter 10. The Confrontation. Harris moved quickly. He couldn't trust the chain of command. He went directly to the Director of Central Intelligence. He laid out the evidence, the Berlin file, Vance's behavior, the missile tech. Vance isn't a double agent, Harris said. He's a whistleblower who had to walk through hell to blow the whistle. The deputy director was quietly removed from his post that night. An internal investigation was launched. It would later be revealed that the deputy director had been blackmailed by the KGB over a personal indiscretion in the 70s and had been feeding them names to keep his own secret buried. Vance was just collateral damage. Vance was released from the holding cell. Harris walked him out to the car. You took a hell of a risk, Harris said, coming back with a fake story about Siberia. I needed you to doubt me, Vance said. I needed you to investigate. If I just walked in and said, the boss is a traitor, I would have disappeared into a psychiatric ward within an hour. I needed to give you a puzzle. The microfilm got me in the door. The behavior made you look closer, and the note led you to the truth. And the blue tiles? Harris asked. Was that part of the plan? Vance paused. He looked at the sky. No. That was just, I really did forget. I spent 3 years trying to remember her face, Harris. I guess I stopped looking at the background. Chapter 11. The Return to Life. Arthur Vance was officially reinstated. He was given a commendation, though it was classified. The star on the wall at Langley was removed, the marble filled in and polished over, leaving only a faint scar in the stone. He went home to the house in Alexandria. Eleanor was waiting. The reunion was not like the movies. It was quiet, awkward. They were two strangers trying to remember how to be a couple. The first night back, Arthur stood in the kitchen. He looked at the white tiles. He ran his hand over them. I like the blue ones better, he said softly. Eleanor, standing in the doorway, smiled through tears. We can put them back. No, Arthur said. Keep them. It's a new kitchen. It's a new life. Chapter 12. The Lingering Shadow. The story of Arthur Vance became a legend within the agency, the man who came back. But legends are rarely the whole truth. 6 months later, Arthur retired. He and Eleanor moved to a cabin in Montana, far away from the Beltway, far away from the embassies and the safe houses. In the archives of the KGB, which were opened briefly in the 1990s after the fall of the Soviet Union, a researcher found a file related to Operation Silent Echo. The file confirmed that Topaz was real. It confirmed the deputy director's treachery. But there was a footnote in the file, dated November 1985. It was a report from a KGB handler in Vienna. It noted that the asset had successfully infiltrated the American extraction team. It noted that the missile data had been accepted as genuine. The footnote was ambiguous. It referred to the asset by a code name, Lazarus. Was Lazarus Arthur Vance? Had the KGB turned him after all? Was the exposure of the corrupt deputy director just a sacrifice the Soviets were willing to make to plant a deeper, more trusted mole in the heart of the CIA? Or was Lazarus someone else entirely? Arthur Vance lived the rest of his life in peace. He never spoke of his time in the wilderness again. He died of natural causes in 2003. But at his funeral, among the family and friends, there was a man standing at the back. A man with a Russian accent who placed a single red carnation on the grave and walked away before anyone could ask his name. The Cold War was a hall of mirrors. Sometimes a man walks out of the mirror, and you can never be quite sure if he's the reflection or the real thing. All we know is that Arthur Vance came back, and the world changed because of it. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the most mysterious chapters of the Cold War, please subscribe. There are thousands of files left to open, and the truth is always stranger than fiction.